There's some time overlap between this era and the ones either side of it, making it the largest of the eras. However, when grouping games together, this just felt the more natural way to do it, as the splits mostly go by console generation. We'll deal with the part I've dubbed Western popularity first, and then mobile game hell later. Let's begin this era off with the big one. Shin Megami Tensei 3 Nocturne, released under the subtitle of Lucifer's Call instead in Europe. There are 3 editions of this game. The original game, released only in Japan in 2003, followed by a director's cut remake with the extra subtitle Maniacs, which featured Dante from the Devil May Cry series in an additional subplot. This came out in early 2004 in Japan, and later that same year for America. The third version was only released in Japan, with limited edition copies of Devil Summoner 2, Raidou Kuzunoha vs King Abaddon, and was nearly identical to the Maniacs edition, save for replacing Dante with Raidou. We'll get to him and his games shortly. All of these were released for the PS2. Nocturne changed and added a lot to the standard SMT formula, many elements of which became standard from then on. A big example is that the game is, at least until the optional extra mode, in third person, unlike the previous 2 mainline games. The most prominent Atlus game before this to feature a third person perspective was Persona 2, which may have impacted this choice. The other major change to this game came from the turn-press battle system. To greatly simplify it, the party can gain or lose turns depending on hitting weaknesses or resistances. Unlike most SMT games, Nocturne didn't have a law chaos alignment system, and used reasons instead. There are 3 reasons that would lead to an ending each: Shijima, Musubi, and Yosuga, each reflecting a different worldview, but all can be considered some variation on chaos. As well as these 3 endings, there are 3 more related to rejecting these reasons: neutral, demon, and true demon. Neutral and demon depending on answers you give, and if they're correct or not, while true demon overrides all other endings and requires the player to defeat all bonus bosses. This game was also the first mainline game released in the West and was received well commercially, which encouraged Atlus to continue releasing future games in the West. Next is the Digital Devil Saga duology for PS2, which we can put into its own Digital Devil Saga branch. These games are fairly heavy on the dungeon crawler element, but I have to say I really like the story they tell. As such, I don't want to give away too much of the plot for these games, but I will say that the second game is a direct sequel to the first. As with many other games, they do not directly link outside of their own branch, so their plot significance on other games is minor, thus I can get away without spoiling it. These games were both released in the West under the Shin Megami Tensei subtitle. Due to the popularity of Nocturne, Atlus decided to brand many of their Megami Tensei games as Shin Megami Tensei in the West, even if they weren't originally branded as such. And at last, we finally get to the modern Persona games. Love them or hate them, these games are an incredibly important part of the Megami Tensei franchise, and they really did start to help the series go into the mainstream. Persona 3 was released in 2006 in Japan, 2007 in America, and 2008 over here in Europe. This game was largely disconnected from the rest of the Megami Tensei franchise. There's a couple of Easter eggs relating to the previous games, such as the Kirijo group branching off from the Nunjo group, in reference to Persona 1 and 2 party member Nunjo. As well as this, previous party members can be seen on the TV in the dorms at various points throughout the game. The most significant addition to the series from Persona 3 was the social link system, renamed to Confidants in Persona 5, and the calendar, splitting the game into social life portions and combat portions, with the player free to choose how they spend their time over the course of the in-game year. Another significant addition, which has stayed with the mainline Persona games since, is the mutation of the turn press system into the one more system, where hitting an enemy's weakness lets that party member gain a follow-up attack. This game was followed up by an enhanced remake, Persona 3 FES, in 2007 in Japan, and 2008 in the West. It added in an extra social link to the main game, as well as some other minor changes, and a 30-hour playable epilogue. In Japan it was also possible to buy this epilogue as a standalone game, but unfortunately in the West, if you owned the main game, you would have to re-buy it, even if you just wanted to play the epilogue. A fully fledged sequel, Persona 4, was released in 2008 in Japan and 2009 in the rest of the world, also on the PlayStation 2. And I'm sorry to say, but I'm normally scum here and this was my first Megami Tensei game. This game used the same engine as Persona 3, but with some slight quality of life improvements, like the ability to control other party members directly. This reused engine and reused assets were due to Atlus's weakened financial position at the time, and the success of this game revitalised the company. Persona 3 had two web-based spin-offs. The first was Persona 3 The Night Before, which was released in 2006. It released exclusively in Japan and was a prequel to Persona 3. This game was closed in 2008 to make way for its successor, Persona Einsof, which in turn closed in 2010. This was also a Japanese exclusive. So that we can get this all done in one go, I'm going to deal with all of the Persona PSP remakes in one section here. Between 2009 and 2012, PSP remakes and ports of all the Persona games before 4 were released. Persona 1's remake featured a remade soundtrack, much more similar to the later entries, and the Western release was much more faithful to the Japanese version, with no awkward race changes, and the second quest was re-implemented. The next release was Persona 3 Portable. This improved on the previous releases of Persona 3 by adding a separate route with a female protagonist, and allowing the player to control other party members in combat. However, the trade-off for this was that during the social life overworld, the player could not directly move around, and instead the game was much more like a visual novel. Both Persona 2 parts received PSP versions. These were fairly faithful to the originals, with some minor additions. The first was released in the West, finally filling in the missing part of the Persona timeline, but the second was strangely not localised, despite the PS1 version already being localised. This could potentially be due to waning sales of the PSP outside of Japan. Sticking with PlayStation, there were two PS2 games released in the Devil Summoner branch. The Raidou Kuzunoha duology, released in 2006 and 2008. Set in 1930s Japan, these games, unlike most other games in the franchise, are real-time action RPGs, still featuring the traditional demon summoning. For the timeline, these are very important games, as they connect to the original Shin Megami Tensei games by featuring an antagonist who has travelled back in time from SMT2 in order to stop that timeline from occurring, thus putting this timeline directly parallel to the SMT timeline. Through Raidou's cameos in SMT3 and the remake of Devil Summoner 2, we'll get to that later, we can also find some connections to SMT3, which until now has no concrete timeline connections, and the rest of the Devil Summoner series, and by extension, the Persona series. This finishes off the major entries in the Devil Summoner branch, though we'll come back to it later for some small additions. Going back to the Shin Megami Tensei branch, we have Shin Megami Tensei Imagine, a PC MMORPG set between SMT1 and SMT2. I haven't played this game, and since the official servers shut down a few years ago, I doubt I'll ever play it. This game began as a PC port of 9, but turned into its own beast. Continuing on with the SMT branch, we have Shin Megami Tensei Strange Journey, released for the DS in 2009. This game may or may not have, at one point in development, been considered Shin Megami Tensei 4, as different members who have worked on the game have said contradicting stories. However, regardless, it's considered a spin-off in its final form. The gameplay is similar to SMT1 and 2, with first-person dungeon crawling and turn-based battles. We can finish off the main games in this era with another pair of games. The two Devil Survivor games are part of their own branch. Devil Survivor 1 was released for the DS in 2009 and is a grid-based tactical RPG, where units move around a grid-based map, but for actual attacking, the game switches to a more familiar RPG setting. This game has multiple endings, however these endings were based more on specific choices related to characters, rather than being specifically alignment based. There were 5 of these endings, with an additional 6th bad end. This game was followed up by a sequel released in 2011. The sequel is unrelated in terms of its main plot, but follows a very similar structure. One particularly notable addition here is the Fate system, which is the equivalent of the Persona social links, and high ranks here would allow you to recruit party members who are not natively in the route that you're on once the split comes. This game has 4 different characters who you could side with to get endings. However, one of them splits into 2 different routes. I'm going to try and run through these as quickly as possible, as there's many books, manga and anime that came from the games we've just mentioned. SMT3 had a short manga and novel adaptation, as well as a drama CD. The Digital Devil Saga game spawned multiple extra entries. There's a 5-volume novel adaptation known as Quantum Digital Devil Saga, a spin-off manga subtitled Shinen no Mato, that's set during the first game starring an original cast, and 2 additional novellas titled That's Catch-22 and Dog Days. Persona 3 had a lot of extra media. Though some were released outside of this time frame, I'm going to list them all here. There was a manga adaptation, which recently finished, a 4-movie anime adaptation, a 5-part stage play adaptation, which is arguably 10 parts, due to there being separate versions for the male and female protagonists, and 12 drama CDs spawned from various versions of Persona 3. There were also 3 spin-off novels, Shadow Cry, Fragments of the End, and Velvet Blue, as well as a novelisation of Persona 3 Fest called Alternative Heart. The epilogue of this led on to the final piece of Persona 3 media here, Persona Trinity Soul. Persona Trinity Soul is a 26-episode anime original sequel to Persona 3, set a decade later. This spin-off itself had a novelisation and a drama CD, but is considered non-canon to the rest of the Persona timeline. Persona 4 likewise had plenty of additional extra pieces of media. The game was adapted into a manga series, which also ended recently, a 2-part stage play, a 26-episode anime series, a single anime movie. There's 2 side story novels, Your Affection and Amnesia or Fog, and a non-canon sequel novel, Detective Naoto, which received its own manga adaptation. Speaking of manga, Persona 4 had a manga spin-off prequel titled The Magician, and of course there's also 5 drama CDs. Moving back to more Shin Megami Tensei looking entries, over in the Devil Summoner branch we have a Raidou Kuzunoha prequel novel, and a manga sequel to the second game, as well as a side story drama CD. To round out this section, we're back with Devil Survivor. Devil Survivor 1 received a drama CD, which largely retold the events of the game, and Devil Survivor 2 received its own anime adaptation. Both games received manga adaptations. Devil Survivor 2's anime received its own additional manga adaptation. Desu 2 had an additional prequel light novel called Cetus's Prequel, and a short story called Thursday 2354. So, yeah, that was a lot, but the next section is going to be a very large amount of mobile games that you may very well not know about. If you thought Atlas already milked the Neo Persona games, then wait until you see what comes next.